Greetings and salutations. Welcome to Life and Books and Everything. I'm your host, Kevin DeYoung, and I'm going to introduce our guest in just a moment, but I want to welcome you to all of our listeners. Glad to have you with us. And as always, thank our sponsor, Crossway. And today I want to mention new book by Dustin Benge, The Loveliest Place, The Beauty and Glory of the Church. That seems like a timely book to reflect upon the glory and the beauty of the church. Obviously, the church always has imperfections, but to reflect on the loveliest place. So this is a new book just coming out this week from Crossway by Dustin Benge, Benge. You've probably seen the name before, The Loveliest Place. So thank you to Crossway. And our guest, I'm really excited about. I've read a number of his things, and in particular, the book that we're going to talk about in just a moment. Dr. Wilfred McClay. We'll go with Bill, since he's a humble scholar. And we're going to talk about his book, Land of Hope, An Invitation to the Great American Story. There's too much bio here to really do Dr. McClay justice, but he is currently the Victor Davis Hanson Chair in Classical History and Western Civilization at Hillsdale College. If you never heard of Hillsdale, you should look it up. There in southeastern Michigan, wonderful Christian liberal arts school for many years before that. He taught at Oklahoma. He serves on all sorts of boards of directors, Ethics and Public Policy Center, senior fellow at the Trinity Forum. He's written lots of books and received numerous awards, lots of articles as well, and First Things and other places. His book, The Masterless, Self and Society in Modern America, 1994, was a winner of the 1995 Award in Intellectual History from the Organization of American Historians. So he's a very well-respected, accomplished historian, and very grateful, Bill, to have you on. So welcome to the program.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you. And as you know, because we talked a little bit before the interview, I'm an admirer, recently acquainted with and admirer. So,
well, thank you.
Although I wonder, you did make you did scrape the bottom of the barrel in getting me on. But
well, no. I'm very, very pleased to have you on. I wonder, before we talk about history, if you can give us a little personal history. Tell us, where are you from, and a few of the places you've been, how you got to Hillsdale recently.
Yeah, well, I was born in the Midwest. I was born in Illinois, but grew up in Maryland. I sort of think of myself as being from both places in a way. Maryland was, from the age of 5 on, really. I got all my education in Maryland, both college. Went to St. John's College in Annapolis, and then Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. Two more different institutions, which are hard to find. St. John's, the great books, a place where you're discouraged from reading secondary scholarship.
Yeah, right.
You're encouraged to read the text and confront. Eva Brand, the great doyeness, if that's the right term,
right,
of St. John's, said, if you have a long introduction in your book, rip it out. So the idea was to encounter the text correctly, unmediated. And then Hopkins is based on the model of the research university of the 19th century, the first in the United States. It's retained a lot of that extremely professional-oriented way. It wasn't the place you went. It felt your intellectual curiosity, building off of the future. And although I managed to indulge my intellectual curiosity plenty, and more importantly, I met my wife.
Very good.
But ever since Hopkins minted, it's more than redeemed kind of memory. Yeah, and actually, one thing I think your listeners may be interested. I was not brought up in the church. I did have a sort of relationship with the Presbyterian Church, Severna Park, Maryland. Which some of your listeners may be from there, and but I never was confirmed. Uh, my parents were, I think, my mother in particular is in the process of losing faith.
Mm.
That just this has a happy ending, but it and so I wasn't really brought up in any of that. Went to St. John's that I started taking the Bible seriously and started reading Aquinas and Augustine and Anselm and Kierkegaard, who destroyed
Oh, really?
highly bad fear and trembling. Oh yeah, changed the way I thought about the Bible. Uh, and so I it still was not a Christian. So I would look at my scene and say, I can't affirm those things. I mean, I don't even know what it means to affirm. So it was a slow process. I went into academic life. I taught at Tulane University in New Orleans. And it was at Tulane that I had serious experience of and um, which happened in all places in the Episcopal Church. You know,
People
God
still
could
get
do
converted
anything.
there. Wow.
That's right. So, so I've remained an Anglican on and off. I've actually there was a period of time which I was a CA husband, very
Uh,
happily so in Maryland. In fact,
what church
I
was
lived
that?
there for a while on a sabbatical, and we were looking after my mother
Okay.
stroke. So anyway, that's kind of it's a big part of my task, and it's a joyful and interesting task, but it has been to take an essentially secular formation, intellectual formation, and try to sort of do a Romans 12 kind of rethink of all of it in light of the renewal of my mind. And I'm still working on it. I still, people like, I'm just assuming you had an early and profound formation in the, I'm actually less envious than I used to be. I'm still envious, but I do think I have one gift, see the world as the unbelieving see it. I
Huh.
can really grasp. It was very hard for people brought up in the faith see the world as those who don't believe. It doesn't.
Yeah.
I get that. Um,
Yeah,
uh,
that's a real gift, and I think it comes through even in your writing, which is really clear and uh, scholarly, but very accessible. And we have a few overlaps. We didn't talk about this. I was born in Illinois. I was born south side of Chicago, and I got married in Maryland.
ah,
My father-in-law, who's now with the Lord, he was a Navy chaplain. He was working at Bethesda. Lived in Annapolis. My wife's
oh
parents
my.
went to PCA Church in Severna Park.
Oh,
We
that's
got
a great church. Yeah.
Yeah, we got
Glenn
married in Laurel,
Parkinson.
right?
Glenn Parkinson was a pastor. I always thought of him as the reincarnation of Jonathan Edwards. He was such a
High
good
praise.
preacher. Yeah.
Yeah, and then
Well,
I mentioned
wonderful.
yeah. So and I mentioned I was in East Lansing for 13 years, and uh, at Hillsdale was hour and a half down the road, and think very highly of it. I actually, before we get into your book on American history, one of your pieces, I've quoted you many times, and I have given you credit for it, but you've showed up in sermons.
My name's Aton Philon, as they say in Greek. The things of friends are common.
Oh, well, thank you.
So,
But it's your article from 2017, the Hedgehog Review, The Strange Persistence of Guilt. It's been really helpful. You want to say something about what prompted you
oh,
writing that article and what it was about?
it was something. It was really a one-off in a way. Um, I was intrigued by the very question that the title puts forward. So why does it is so much of I'll tell you the moment that, that the idea of where it began to crystallize was when I was at Tulane and we did a search, and it was at that time there was not a single black person on the faculty at Tulane, which was a disgrace and not something you could easily sort of slough off onto other considerations. So there was an enormous amount of pressure on the history department to hire somebody with the right pigmentation and cultural background. I don't want to trivialize it. I actually, even though affirmative action has been on balance a bad thing, I think it has accomplished many good things, and it's a whole discussion.
Mm-hmm.
But at any rate, we got to the point where I was the one conservative, and then when I became a Christian, that was even worse. So I was this sort of person of no account, and being very junior and all. But all my colleagues got into fighting about who was the more liberal and who was showing implicit racism in their attitudes about this candidate or that candidate. It was just an astonishing spectacle of all of us wanting the same thing. We all wanted to sort of break the color barrier in our department. There's no doubt about good intentions, faith of everyone involved, but it devolved into this show. Everyone accusing one another of being insufficiently woke would be the term now, but
right.
And it made an enormous impression on me. I thought, this is something that's driven by very powerful forces that have a moral component to it, and that the people involved in it are not even aware. So it got me thinking, and it just was one of those things you think about for years. It wasn't on my agenda right about, but Kevin, I'm so glad you mentioned it now, because I'm just pivoting towards. I wrote that article in the Hedgehog Review, got a huge response. I mean, there were I got lecture invitations from Australia to on the basis that it was partly because David Brooks wrote about it, and get some the New York Times. It goes out, and there were some other people. So hit all those channels.
Yeah.
But it was just ahead of the you say 2017. I mean, I maybe it wasn't ahead of, but certainly was not at sort of the peak tide of wokeness that has now engulfed us, and we're trying to make sense of. And by the way, I wouldn't normally talk about it. The term woke,
right?
And there are genuine moral. One of the things I tried to bring out in that article are genuine moral issues. I don't ridicule my students who are caught up in the sense that if on environmental issues, I talk about that a lot. They really sort of, in a way, don't have any right to exist because they're carbon footprint adding to the problem. They're consuming other living things, which is unjust. And even if it's plants, I mean, you can, if you have a sort of vestigial Christian conscience, biblical conscience, but no way of dealing with or expiating guilt,
right.
understanding sin as part of the human condition, you are in a very bad place.
Yeah, and that's what was so important about the article. And it came out in 2017, and I referenced it in some lectures I gave about the Reformation and about the ongoing importance of Luther and justification, because as you said, we're not done with guilt. In fact, we're awash in guilt. You go online, Neo-Puritans, that gives Puritans a bad name, but there's guilt everywhere. But your point was, we have a basic Christian conception of being guilty, but we don't any longer have the Christian mechanism to atone for that guilt. So it's the
Yes.
worst of all worlds.
Yeah, it really is. It really is the worst. Oh, that's well put. I may steal that from you, but
Sure.
with attribution,
No,
though.
no.
Yeah. So anyway, I was actually decided I was going to write a book about it, and I started working, and then along came this. I really was approached about doing this textbook in American history because and in a funny way, it fits in perfect with guilt theme. I had felt this was going to be a complete diversion, but I finally was talked into doing it. And it really ended up being a book that attempted to account for our many national sins and transgressions in an unwhitewashed, that's probably the wrong term,
Yeah, right.
unsugarcoated way. Um, but within a larger perspective of what's magnificent in our history and what is possible yet, and that hope, uh, hope in its many acceptations, is really at the heart of it. That there is something special about America in this sense of possibility. That
Yeah.
in our times of greatest discouragement and woe, is this sense that we can change it and change our. And just as the people who came here decade after decade, century after century, believed that they didn't have to be condemned to the conditions of their birth. And
Yeah.
that's, I think, is fundamental in American assertion, as you're like. So
Yeah. Well,
I had a hard time getting started on it because, and my wife can recall, we went to the beach in the summer, and I was going to stay there for a month that we'd never done. It's too much, but and we left early. But I had managed to write 3 or 4 pages. Ridiculous, but that time was crucial to calibrate away from my academic style to writing something that was really meant to be directed at just regular general readers, Americans, and although the target audience was high school students,
mm-hmm.
I always thought of it as having something more of a reach, and so in a way, I'm not that surprised that the main readership of the book so far has been adults, people the age of 30, over the age of 50, right, maybe even, but it's finding its way into school, and I'm happy.
Good. Well,
but what I wanted to do was to make it that also to be very, very approachable, readable. So that's actually very hard because
that's true.
If you're, you know how it is in your historian, you're a theologian. You always want to explain everything, partly to show to the learned audience, hey, I know about all that stuff.
Yeah. I read that book. Okay, I know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, and then my footnotes are things there. But partly because you do sense the complexity of the subject, you want to reflect it. You can't indulge either one of those things. Writing a book like Land of Hope, you have the courage to leave things out and know that people are going to say, "Where's this? Where's it? What?" And you don't say enough about this, about the Lithuanian coal miners in East Kentucky. Okay, I left that out.
Yeah, that's right. One of the things, though, I really appreciated about, and you've hit on it already, the title, Land of Hope, An Invitation to the Great American Story. Some people, given our cultural moment, would say, oh, how dare you, Land of Hope. Don't you know what we did to the Native Americans, and don't you know Jim Crow? But what I appreciate is you obviously do know those things, and I have a mark here. You talk about, the Trail of Tears is just one of the most shameful episodes in American history. So you don't, as you said, you don't sugarcoat it. You don't pretend that for America to be a land of hope is a land of perfection or anything close to it. And it's not just a clearing of the throat. Yeah, we did some bad things. And yet you do a very good job of holding together a basic cohesive story around this theme that it's a place that people have wanted to come to because there's possibilities. And at its worst, it's an inconsistency with itself. It's a self-hypocrisy that there are noble ideals, there are real rooted virtue in the American experiment from 1776. That 1619 is not the real genesis of course that matters too, but the from Lincoln to MLK, they were always looking back to the founding and to the importance there and the ideals there. And it was actually some of the Southern Confederates who said, no, we don't really believe in that founding story. No, the mainstream has been there's an important story to be told about America. And I think you tell it so well because you don't pretend that it's all good. And yet you don't go to the other end and say, well, now we can't do anything but self-flagellate. I've said before, we've moved away from hagiography to hamartiography, that being the word for sin. All we can tell is the story about our sins, not as saints. So how did you think about doing that? Because that's when I've recommended the book to people often, that's what I've really been struck by, is how you tell a story of hope without pretending that there aren't really ugly spots in the story.
Well, I mean, I do think you have to have you have to have a perspective that's outside. You've gone through graduate study in history, and you know what I'm talking about. It's hard to communicate to others who haven't had experience, but there really is a way in which, first of all, graduate school is an enormously powerful kind of instrument of conformity that people come out of it, and it really have to. There's a lot of talented writers, historians who will name their name in this conversation, and that you have to kind of divest yourself of what you learned. You know, it's not that it wasn't of value. It's sort of monomaniacal in its obsession with fault finding, hamartia.
Yeah.
And I love that word. Did you invent that? I mean, that's
as far as I know, I did.
Yes, yes.
Hamartiography, yes.
Okay, that's my second theft.
Yeah, well.
No, that's wonderful. And you have to. It's professional deformation almost involved in the field opera. And if you're not saying something, if you're not writing a dissertation some way critical of America or white America, and in some ways the being critical is more important than the affirming of the other. You know, I love dissertation that works that rescue African American writers from obscurity. It's really hard where America's coming out with a bunch of writers that nobody's ever heard of, and they're not really all of the highest order, obviously, partly. But that kind of thing. I'm willing to undergo some overextension on that in the name of something positive, covering positive legacy that we're not aware of, or more generally, we're not aware. But it's the sort of making white. And I was told the other day that someone on staff at National Endowment for Humanities now is making sort of deconstructing whiteness a kind of major theme. This to me is just, it's ridiculous in addition to being not very productive. So I think you have to take the critical elements for what they're worth. You have to simplify it somewhat. You have to read Howard Zinn's book, People's History of the United States, was probably the most popular text out there. and then realized, well, there's a difference between saying that Columbus was not a man that was a man of his time. It was not a saint, to making him into a demon,
Right.
corrupted an entire. This is wrong. Actually, it's wrong in terms of a larger sort of historical judgment. So you have to that. And I think something else that I think people have appreciated about it, that I try to be generous towards the past.
Mm-hmm.
I tried in a way that something like the 1619 Project, extremely ungenerous and tendentious in its depiction of. And I don't even want to pick on that because that's very typical. There's just a sense that people of the 17th century or whatever previous century, by all rights, should be held to the standards of the present. And if their statues on the city square have been sitting there unaccosted, it's time to bring them down. It's time.
Right.
How can we admire someone like Jonathan Edwards I mentioned before?
Right.
And own brush with the institution. How do we admire Frederick Douglass, the great Black American revolutionist, a great orator, has been one of his statues was torn down because insufficient women's rights, and deemed by the president.
Famously spoke at Hillsdale.
Oh yes,
Frederick Douglass.
yes. We have a statue of him right by my office.
Yeah,
I walk by it every day. It's very
not
inspiring.
many places have statues of Jefferson, Frederick Douglass, Ronald Reagan. I forget which other. Winston Churchill, Margaret Thatcher.
Thatcher. It's in Madison, and then there's a sort of anonymous Civil War soldier. And Hillsdale was from the very beginning admitted women and people of all
founded
races.
by abolitionists, right?
Yes. So we're very proud of that here, and but generosity toward the past. Jefferson, for example, I think very complicated man, inconsistent man. It's what I try to. I don't really do this. I try with my classes that in some ways we should admire him for his inconsistencies, because he at least had, there was a revolution in moral sensibility taking place in the Western on this issue, and he got he understood the revolution or the ideational part of that. What he couldn't do is bring his life into it. And this is a very human problem. But I also say, and I think this is part of being a good historian, is to know when to quit historicizing and or talking about the pretentious assertion of the 1619 Project that slavery and anti-Black racism is in our DNA, which is a stupid thing to say about it. Sure, it doesn't have DNA. Culture has inertia, maybe, but it doesn't have make. But the thing is, who are we, given the disharmony in our way to be critical? I mean, we float on this ocean of cheap consumer goods and cheap everything in the Western world because of a whole class of people on the other side of the world we never see, who are enslaved in every meaningful sense of the word. Slavery hasn't disappeared from the world. It's been made illegal. That doesn't mean it's a country like Mauritania, 25%, according to the Institute. But why is the New York Times obsessing about 400 years ago? then there is a problem right
That's right.
that we can actually do something about. And the scale, actually, arguably, of our our complicity in Chinese slavery is so much more than the Atlantic slave trade. Just in terms of numbers, in terms of the kind of the gross uh, economic.
That's right. And we've just gotten
I didn't mean to get
through.
off on this, but I
No,
think it's an
no,
example of why we lose perspective when we obsess over the past. And it's not as if the past is a bunch of minor peccadillos. I'm not saying that. It's horrifying. But slavery has been a feature of human civilization, in most places. It's the rule rather than the exception. Sean Wilentz, his wonderful book on why the Constitution not pro-slavery makes this point that the remarkable thing is a society that frees itself from this scourge and that really begins to try to live out an ideal of equality, which I think for us all really means seeing the image of God in every single.
that's right. And there are real important theological intersections. You mentioned image of God. You also talk about in your book, you talk about the founders and their basic views of humanity and how they're were shaped, whether implicitly or explicitly, by Calvinist, Augustinian views of the human person. It was not a Rousseauian view of humankind that's basically good and human nature is malleable and civilization corrupts. No, it was a view that, famous Federalist Papers 10 or 51, ambition needs to be made to counteract ambition because government is not run by angels. And I did my historical work. This is my one beef with the book. I'm not sure if you mentioned John Witherspoon or not.
I don't. You're
Oh,
not
well,
the
that's
first to beef
okay.
at me about it.
Yeah, that's okay. So I did my PhD on Witherspoon, and so I'm focused more on his Scottish career. But certainly he had, in effect, a very direct impact on Madison, the father of the Constitution.
Oh yes,
so
absolutely.
So that whether Madison was, what sort of Christian he was remains to be seen. But certainly a basic distrust of the human person, unfettered from any other constraints. And I think that really shapes too how we do history and what we expect to find in history. So like you said, when we do history, American history or any kind of history, they're not just minor peccadillos. It's not just, a few mistakes. I mean, they're really egregious sins because human beings are really egregious sinners. And it's not at all to placate those sins, but we should go with the expectation that there's going to be a lot of sin here. And so the question is always not just how were people, but how were they compared to others, or how were they compared to their time, or what were the known alternatives to acting the way that they did? We can all say, well, we wish they would have acted like people in 2022. Well, in some ways that would have been good, and they would certainly look askance at us in some ways that we don't act like we're 1776 or whatever the year is. So if we have a proper anthropology, we should look at the past expecting, of course, when you have millions of people over hundreds of years, whether you call it American history, white evangelicalism, whatever you want to look at, you're going to have a lot of bad things to deal with. But the question is, what did they see as their own motivation? What were the options available to them? And how did they understand themselves? And how do we try to fairly, you say at the end here, this line, was it from Butterfield about the historian is a recording angel, not a haunting demon?
Hanging judge.
Yeah, from Herbert Butterfield, not a hanging judge. And so you said, while I try to be objective, I've not claimed to be neutral in all respects. There's a crucial difference. So you say this book is offered as a contribution to the making of American citizens, a patriotic endeavor as well as a scholarly one. But you say two things, celebration and criticism, and those are not necessarily enemies. And I think any one of us, whether official historians or just erstwhile interested people trying to make sense of the past, should keep those two things in mind. Do you sense you're a professional historian, I'm not, but do you sense that we've really lost the plot on this with kind of the guild of historians? I mean,
Yeah, oh yeah, I do. I do think we have, and I think that the guild has sort of decided that there is no plot.
that's a
There's
good way to
merely
put it.
the story of the plots of subgroups, which one of my teachers at John Hyatt, one of the early seeing America as a more pluralistic society. He wrote an information history. He was a very waspy guy himself. He had a great sense of sympathy. Toward the end of his career, he wrote an essay which this is really getting out of hand. The story of the subgroup, and I forget how he put it. The story of the subgroups has no meaning apart from the larger story. The pluribus needs the uno.
Yeah.
To be pluribus rather than just a scatteration of things. And it's a profound, simple, profound point. And I think it's gone unheeded. I think he was at the end of his career. He would never have said this public. I had a conversation, had some regrets about what had unleashed. There was one other attempt to Philip of Harvard, big, much more pitched at fellow historians. It was an attempt to sort of tell the whole. I don't really. I don't think it really succeeded. In the end, she's too dubious about the story to be convincing. And I say that with all. I do something within the profession. I don't know that it's succeeded. I think you and the story is in some ways, and I use this word without pejorative intent, a myth. A myth being something. Well, one of the things I say in the introduction, here where were you reading? America's an aspirational country, and if you don't understand that, you don't take that into account in your account of America, you're missing a whole dimension. And so the people who pound away, it's very tiresome. And the idea that American exceptionalism, there's this illusionary idea of American exceptionalism. And look, I don't actually care that term, American exceptionalism, but I think, who was it? There was a sociologist, Robert K. Merton, I think, said that social facts are real, even if they are only believed to be real. That, in other words, you have a whole society of people who believe in the exceptional character of society. It's a fact. It becomes a fact. It's a fact in our makeup. This is what I'm calling about the myth. A myth is not a falsehood, not a lie. I mean, I'm very much in the tradition of Lewis and Tolkien on this, that it is saying
there are true myths. Yeah,
there are true myths. And there are myths that are yet to be fulfilled. They're a kind of roadmap of the land, the unexplored, yet to be explored. And they're aspirational in character. I think that, and this is true in our individual lives. I think one way to break some of this barrier is to ask, and by analogy, think about the nation. And gosh, there's so many things to say about that. But you mentioned the balance of affirmation and criticism, celebration, and I do have a point in the book where I say, don't we do this in our personal relationships? Doesn't a good relationship, good friendship, good marriage depend on the ability to both affirm and to criticize and accept criticism, accept affirmation? Sometimes people have trouble doing that. But accept those things are in a balance, just as in the life of the church. Celebration and repentance
That's right.
are both part of our having a God, uh, having a Lord accepts repentance and frees us
That's right.
from the consequence of our sins. It's what a cause for celebration. Um,
That's right.
uh, so there's a balance of these things, and that criticism with exit without redemption, just pounding away at the um, is just to say it's not a very fruitful enterprise.
Well,
And
no, and the people, they're dead. They can't they can't repent. I don't believe in postmortem repentance.
and
We can't change what they've done. And I like, just go back to a point you made about the myth, the story of America. If the only story we tell is celebration, well, that's not honest. But now, if the only story we tell is denunciation, and the irony is, you point this out, I won't grab it, but I underlined it both at the front and at the end of your book. You talk about American patriotism has typically been different than blood and soil kind of nationalism. And the irony is, if people want to just break down unrelentingly any sort of story of America as a land of hope, the alternative to bring people together is going to be blood and soil. It's not going to be an aspiration. It's not going to be an idea. It's not going to be the best of the Western and the Christian moral tradition, but it's going to be what we're seeing now. It's going to be increasingly smaller and smaller identity groups because we have to find belonging. We need to we all want to be a part of something bigger than ourselves. And that's one of, I think, the real dangers in continuing to pound away without any balance to it. The forces unleashed are not just going to be, academic annoyance. They're going to have real world effects where people realize,
I
somebody
agree.
said, if you didn't like the religious right, wait till you see the unreligious right. It's going to be a lot worse.
Yeah, I think Rod Dreher said that
Yeah,
repeatedly.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's coming. It's here. It's um, I think you know I think really in we can recover this balance that you and I are talking about.
So I know you
And
got
it's
a hard
mm,
stop. You got a hard
yeah,
stop
yeah.
coming up. Can I ask you, because I don't know when I'll have you again, and you're on the planning committee for the 250-year anniversary, right, for the country?
I am. I
Can you
am.
tell us any? Don't divulge any secrets. Are you building another Statue of Liberty, or how's that going? Is this going to be
It's
a good
going badly.
endeavor? Oh
It's
boy.
going badly because people, um, uh, there's a sense that this ought but some of the it's a very political committee. The members of the commission were selected by the sort of top figures in the Congress. So I was selected by Paul Ryan and others. And, I actually think there's a core of us that together very um, recognize that that we're all sort of in this boat together. But there are definitely people who want to capture. Um, so I think we haven't had. We had a whole discussion, I think 2 hours or so, about whether or not this event should be regarded as a celebration, a commemoration, a mere sort of marking of the date. Um, my book was published shortly after we had this discussion, and I decided to show up at the meeting with 30 copies of the book and give them out to everyone.
Well, good.
The chairman of the commission was so grateful. He said, "I want to about 15 minutes or so and squeeze it into the meeting and talk about it." So I used that to say, folks, if we don't do this as a celebration, we're traducing the will and the needs of the American people, and we also are being blind to the extent to which this country, with all of its faults, has been a beacon in human history. And that was very well received. I think everybody was happy to get a party favor copy of my book, but I that hasn't lasted. I think actually the election the previous presidential election may have some favor. Getting Democrats felt to finally,
Right.
but it hasn't really given them any focus. So I'm a little discouraged at the moment, and we now have this sex harassment thing that has come up that is I have no idea what it's about or whether it's has deeper causes. But I would ask your audience to pray.
That's a good request.
Centennial Commission. We need your prayers. I accomplished that. I'm going to run over my own time. Tell you
Please do.
The point I've tried to make, my fellow commissioners, is let's not think as the occasion where we have to settle all the scores and say who was right in American history. Think of it instead as one of these big family reunions where every member of the Smith clan, from all sea to shining sea, and they all come together in this very crowded. And there are people on different sides of the party who are not speaking. There are divorces. There are all kinds of messiness of life, and there are all kinds of arguments who was right and who was wrong. Let the arguments continue. They will anyway.
Right.
But instead, let's come together and say, okay, we're a big, quarrelsome bunch, but we are the Smith family. And now, country is not a family. I know all these, an analogy is just an analogy. But I think it's a pretty darn good for thinking about, we don't have to decide whether we are all now in favor of gay marriage or all now in favor of, right to work or whatever. We don't have to decide. What we have to do is just pause for a moment and say, thank God for what we have.
No, that's
and what we've been given
really
by
well put.
The imperfect people of the past. And may we be judged more gently than we are now judging them.
That's right. No, that's a wonderful analogy. It's a great way to end too. And a family reunion, or we've all been to, I remember going to my grandparents' 50th wedding anniversary. Yes. And you're there, and if all of the siblings and grandkids and aunts and uncles are all fighting over their politics, and guys, this is not what this day is about. You can do that on some other days. And so that's true as we approach the 250th anniversary of the country. And it's just a good way to look at life, whether it's history or not. There are times certainly to duke it out, but so often, and the internet just instills this in us. Yes, and I feel like so much of the historiography has become this. It's never the wedding anniversary. It's never the family reunion. It's always an adjudication before the tribunal.
And it's never Sunday worship either.
That's right.
You're talking about a quality of mind that can set aside whatever the antagonism of the moment is to say, there's a larger context here. There's something larger. I'm really worried about my kid, or I'm really worried about my car, or, putting a new roof on the house or whatever. Thinking about that Sunday morning and sit in the pew and listen to you preach. That's a whole different, and in a way, that ability to set things aside in name of something higher, or at least more inclusive, more abstract.
Yeah,
that's exactly what you're talking about. I mean, that 50th wedding anniversary, the big family. We need that ability as human beings to say, to give ourselves a Sabbath from our everyday cares.
That's well put.
And that's why God laid out the plan for us. All we need is
to
follow it.
That's right. Let me mention again for our listeners, The Land of Hope. Here it is, very nicely done. Is it in paperback now?
It is in
Yep.
paperback, and also I do want to make a pitch. We're coming out with a young readers edition, which is
Yeah.
for uh, middle school and younger. We think fifth graders can handle it.
It's a great resource.
So,
Adults can read it. So I read it. It's published by Encounter Books. They did a nice job. It's well laid out. There's other sorts of resources. So please check that out. Wilfred McClay, Land of Hope. He has many other books and articles. And boy, I hope that one place or another we can sit down and talk. And maybe
we'll
Miles
do
Smith,
it.
maybe even Daryl Hart will let me in the room and we can
I
chat.
I just had dinner with him last night, and
Okay, good.
he was very pleasant. His
Well,
wife
good.
was there. That always helps. With
Oh, well,
Annie
yeah,
there.
that's
She
right. That's
keeps
right.
them
You
alive.
talk Johns Hopkins talk. Well, thank you so
Okay.
much.
Well,
And
we will
God
do
bless you
that,
on your
and
work.
maybe we'll get your son up here.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you so much.
All right. Bye-bye.
All
Bye,
right.
everybody.
Until next time, glorify God, enjoy Him forever, and read a good book.